When we think about why we haven't yet realized the kind of democracy we want, it's not because people haven't been fighting for it for forever. And it's not because people don't have big, bold ideas, which they do. It's because there are forces and groups that profit from the breaking of our democracy, that profit from the hoarding of economic and political power, and that will do anything to keep us from realizing the democracy that we know we want.
We've given our democracy over to markets. We've given our markets over to corporations, and our corporations are run by often overpaid CEOs and other corporate executives who actually don't have the greater public good in mind. Here's how I know our democracy is broken. Two political scientists did a study of over 2,000 federal decisions, basically showing that the only people who had influence were lobbyists and corporate executives. The influence of regular people was statistically zero. You can actually solve that problem if you make better rules for who has access to our decision makers, but it is not okay to have a democracy where regular people have actually no influence. When you build a democracy and an economy that is good for some but excludes others, eventually that system's going to come down like a house of cards.
A lot of people will often think about economic policy as a thing that comes out of a democratic process, right? We elect our representatives, they make policy, and then that the policy is what it is. But if you think about the kind of democratic crisis that we're in, the reality is that we can't have an inclusive democracy without having an inclusive economy. The challenge for building an inclusive economy really boils down to a couple of key critical fights that are playing out over these next few years. The first is a fight over private and corporate power. Who actually controls the economy? Who is making the decisions that affect how our entire economy operates, and how do we get at that? So that means everything from Wall Street to big tech to anti-monopoly policies. The second fight is about public goods. Who actually is able to access those things, from education to healthcare to clean air and water, that make our lives possible and that make inclusion possible, and making sure that we all have access to those goods. The third thing is rebuilding and democratizing our government itself. We can't have an inclusive economy without a resourced and financed and staffed government that oversees the economy, and without having a government that is actually reflective and responsive to all of us, we the people.
If you look at the 1940s and the 1950s, you had a kind of democratic, small d, liberalism that in many ways did work to bring growth and prosperity to many people. However, in a lot of ways, there was a rot at the core of even how we constructed that mid-century political economy. And I think that rot was both racial and gendered exclusion. You still had many laws, even at this time that people sometimes think of as the golden age of capitalism, both laws and practices that excluded Black Americans, women, Asian Americans from jobs, from full inclusion in the labor market, from labor protections, union protections.
When I think about this moment, it really feels like a moment where everything is up for grabs. And I think for a lot of us, we experience that as a source of fear and anxiety, and that's real and deeply felt. But it's also a moment of extraordinary opportunity.
We have this ideological vacuum, which means that there's room for many new ideas, big ideas, bold ideas, ideas for inclusion that bring economy and democracy together in a way that I haven't seen in my political or professional lifetime. Our solutions have to take real power into real account, and often we're going to have to build countervailing power, public power, worker power, people power, in order to make sure that good ideas are baked into our institutional forms, and ultimately that people who have those good ideas are at the decision-making table.
I'm hopeful because for the first time in a while, we're having a serious debate about breaking up concentrations of corporate power, about universal access to healthcare, to education, to childcare, about who should actually govern, how we actually get communities involved directly in the economic policymaking process, whether it's at the city level or at the federal level.
More and more people older people, younger people, my own kids are now much more politically active. And so I think the fact that this conversation, this civic conversation, this political conversation, this economic conversation is happening everywhere, that gives me a lot of hope.